Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Marjorie Childress. I'm the managing editor of New Mexico in Depth, and I'm joined today by Trip Jennings, our executive director at New Mexico in Depth, and Mason Graham, policy director of Common Cause New Mexico, who we thought would be a great guest today because we're going to dive into bills that talking about an area of legislation that's on the agenda this year during the legislative session that New Mexico in Depth has covered for a long time, and that Common Cause has been involved in equally as longer actually. We're going to dive into that. First, we're going to talk a little bit about just kind of current events. But first, let me just say we welcome comments and questions from folks who've joined us. Please use the Q&A function, weigh in. We'll be monitoring it. We'll read your comment or your questions, and we really want to hear from you. And just to let you know, this is being recorded, and the transcript will be published with the video on our website tomorrow, or a few days later. So, welcome everyone, and why don't we just dive in? I'm gonna ask Trip to lead off. Let's talk a little bit about current events, like what's been happening and what's on people's minds right now.
Well, I mean, I can't help think about how you and I spent yesterday, Tuesday,
Mhm.
when I believe Monday night, you and I saw the stories about the pause in federal grants and loans, and I think both of us kind of woke up yesterday morning, kind of, what does this mean for New Mexico? So we spent all of yesterday, trying to figure out from state officials, and then and I remember making calls to folks I thought who might know, who could talk to me kind of on background, which is not for attribution, not for comment or whatever, on what this meant. And we spent all day then trying to understand this. We got on a couple of Zoom calls with the Attorney General, who has joined 22 other states to sue the Trump administration to stay this pause, and then had a hour long maybe Zoom with a congressional delegation. We also looked at all the federal and the state budgets of the last 10 years just to see how much federal aid is. 40% of each of the last 10 years, state budgets, federal funds have represented about 40%. So it was a pretty big deal. So that's on my mind right now. And then also, frankly, how it impacts the legislative session. We are one of the most dependent states on federal funds. And last night there went out an email to 2 million federal employees, just kind of like giving them the option to have a buyout. And New Mexico, as you might guess, has many thousands of federal employees. So I'm also thinking about how that hits. That's where my mind is, in addition to like the legislative session.
Mhm.
We went through this in 2017, 2018, the first term, where we've been through this, had the intersection between the federal administration and the state. But there's been a lot more in the first week.
Yeah,
Uh,
the yesterday was a little bit of a one-two punch. It was like, okay, pause, pause federal funding to for grants and aid, and there's a lot of those programs in our state that would be affected. It is now on pause. A federal judge put it on pause, put it on hold. And then the email then offering 2 million federal employees a buyout. So it was kind of all at the same time, and it does raise a lot of questions about how it affects us. Mason, were you at the Roundhouse yesterday? We're kind of wondering. We were a little, Trip and I weren't there, and we kept wondering, well, how is this? I mean, is this trickling into that space, or are people talking about it?
Well, I was there yesterday, and I kind of keep, the news in one tab on my phone, and everything else going on in the other. So I was following the story. I haven't heard much from the people that I've talked with, other than, "Hey, did you see what Trump did?" And so that's usually what happens. I mean, our state is heavily relying on federal funds, like you mentioned. We have a population of people who are has some disparities. Thinking about removing things like Head Start. When I was in my previous role, we did a lot of things with the senior centers. So like Meals on Wheels, not having the enough funding, and then things that are like directly related to New Mexico. Water is and water resources, that comes from federal dollars. Those people who have to manage that, and the trickle down effect it's less of a trickle down. It's more like a someone turning on a faucet. If we were not to have those dollars to maintain our water supply, make sure our most vulnerable individuals have the things, basic things that they need: food, shelter, education. It's scary.
No, it's interesting that, I mean, I think what you're speaking to there is, um, I mean, there's a lot of this kind of national flurry of news, over the past week. I think this was this moment when all of a sudden a lot of people were like, wait a second, this could really impact me here on the ground in a real concrete way, in terms of, all of these services that we get. In a way, it was like, there's this moment of people just thinking, this is real and this could really strip away things that I really rely on. It just seemed like there was a waking up of sorts. Although we did hear from one lawmaker at the end of the day that he was unaware of it. So it made me like envision lawmakers with their heads down working on bills and not really paying attention.
It's fast paced, so I'm not
Hmm.
surprised.
Definitely. Well, Trip, any final comments on
No, no,
that or
to your kind of national kind of like this response to the pause, I looked at the 22 states that were actually New Mexico and 22 states and the District of Columbia. And I looked at the states, and there were a few Republican-led states. This is a situation where all 50 states, as you guys are talking about, this kind of thing would cascade down, ripple through all the way from state government. This is something that we know covering the legislature over many, many years is the state often has pass-through money. And so it passes it through to counties, cities, all this kind of stuff, and all sorts of programs. We heard from folks that there were people calling about like the cops grant. It's vulnerable communities, but also police departments. It's so it politically, it probably hit hard for a lot of folks along the
yeah.
spectrum.
And I
Uh,
think it, that sense of outrage had an impact because I'm just now seeing crossing my desk here just now. The Washington Post is is reporting that they've rescinded that memo, that directive. So, I mean, it's
Wow, really?
yeah.
Right
Hmm.
now?
I mean, a
As
judge
you
had put
heard
it on
here.
hold, but now, as we're speaking, the Washington Post is um, reporting that the administration has rescinded that order.
Can we pause this thing so I can go read the story? That's just a joke, guys. That's just a joke. I
No,
mean,
I mean, we could
ideally, I
talk
kind of
about
want to
this.
pull it up.
Honestly, we could talk about this the whole hour.
I know we could. I that was just a joke. I'm just
But why don't we move into, talking about um, campaign finance, salaries for lawmakers, elections, all the stuff that we spend a lot of time on, and we know people are, interested in. We're at New Mexico in Depth have long been super interested in these areas, and so we're so pleased to have you, Mason.
yeah,
Maybe we'll give you a minute. I think it would be really good for people to hear from you, like who is Common Cause, what is,
Yeah,
and then tell us a little bit about the particular priorities, which I know there's some overlap with the reporting we have planned during the session, and maybe we can just kind of dive in.
sure. Yeah, so I am actually the policy director for Common Cause New Mexico, which is one of about 38 branches of Common Cause. We started in the 1970s, so we've been around for a very long time. Essentially, our role is being the voice of the people in government spaces. Uh, what I do at Common Cause as the policy director is I look for things related to our policy initiatives, which tend to cover good government, accountability and transparency, money in politics, redistricting, and elections, of course. And so here in Common Cause, New Mexico, it's exciting because we have a very diverse landscape. And so our policy tends to inform, how we're going to approach, our landscape tends to inform how we're going to approach our policy initiatives. Some overlap with what we do nationally, some maybe not so much. For instance, the legislators who our legislators don't receive a salary. We're the last state that doesn't pay our legislators. Other things that we look at is, of course, campaign finance, the reporting of contributions to candidate campaigns. We also have taken a close look at, lobbyist reform. That's something that we've always kept a close eye on as far as like the regulation and the reporting of lobbyist activities. And then elections in our state, we have always been really closely active in that space. I love to say that we have the number one state for elections after that recent report from MIT. So that's something I'm always like really, putting out there and bragging about to my colleagues in other states that, we're the
And
best
that's
state.
in terms of like election integrity and election access and all of those
Absolutely.
sorts of things.
Yes. And so this year we are working with the Secretary of State, of course, on some of they always do like an election cleanup bill for some technical improvements, and then also funding as well. So those are things that we work on, right now in regards to elections. And in the past, there's been some like bigger changes like the New Mexico Voting Rights Act, which has created opportunities for improved accessibility, same day registration, and those types of things. And then
Mhm.
to that end, also opening up our primaries to decline the states. Right now, we do have the same day registration that allows someone to change their political party on the day of election. But during a primary election, if you don't want to do that and you're declining the state, you're essentially disenfranchised. And DTS is the largest party here in
Mhm.
New Mexico, about 33%, or even possibly a little bit higher. So,
That's a really high percentage. I didn't realize it had gotten that high. I mean, we've reported over the years of on that growth. But yeah, it's significant.
yeah.
Mason, can I ask you a question? Because I seem to think that there are other states that have open primaries. California comes to mind. How many states do have open primaries right now? Do you know?
Uh,
Or
I couldn't tell you
five
the
or
exact
six?
number, but I know that some of our close neighbors, I believe Colorado has an open primary system that they've recently adopted, and we have a common cause in Colorado as well.
Yeah.
So because our declining state population is so large, and these are really important, primaries are really important consequential elections. So excluding that group of people can, really narrow the playing field to what I think that how people view politics is choosing the lesser of two evils. And if you don't want that, then you should vote in the primary.
Hmm.
uh, and at the same on that same end, I could make an argument for ranked choice voting,
Mm.
which is something that we support here at Common Cause. We're not there at the state level yet, but that's something that we might be looking at in the future.
Hmm. Can we talk a little bit about the specific open primary bill? So I know that Senator Worth, the Senate Majority Leader, is sponsoring it, along with several others, Natalie Figueroa, Kathleen Cates, Christina Parahone, and Angelica Rubio. Um, but I noticed so what it would do is it would allow decline people who are not registered with either major party. They could be registered with a minor party, registered as declined to state or whatnot. They could request a ballot to vote in either major party's election. That's my understanding of it. So they could request a ballot for either major parties, but not both primary election without changing their registration. And I think I noticed in Common Cause's priority list of their legislation they're focused on this session. That's one of them. And you called it a partial open. Did I read that right? And why would you consider it a partially open primary?
Yeah, I believe the term is semi-open primary
Okay.
election. Um, that's interesting that you mentioned that. I'm not 100% sure why it's called a semi-open primary. I believe that there's a distinction between fully open primaries. Um, but as I'm leading, I actually have pulled up the legislation right now in front of me. And what it describes is that, yes, you can vote in a primary election without changing your party designation status. But I believe that the distinction is that you do have to choose either a Democrat or a Republican party. We don't tend to have third party candidates run in primary elections. That might be the reason why it's called a semi-open primary.
I see.
We don't have
Okay.
a third party. Yeah.
Do you, and just jump right in here because I don't want to monopolize Mason's stuff. Do you, I mean, do you think, I mean, one of the arguments, obviously, I think against this is from the parties themselves saying, why should other people who aren't part of our party get to help select our candidates for the general election? I mean, what do you think? How would you respond to that as someone who advocates for it?
Well, a lot of people participate politically in a lot of different ways. I'll just use my own experience. Because when I registered to vote, I actually did register independent, not declined state, but independent, so third party. And I remember the first election that I went to go vote in was for mayor, and that was one election that you are not able to vote as an independent, and you have to be part of the Republican or Democratic Party. And at the time, I didn't really align with one specific set of politics for either party. And I think a lot of people feel that way.
Hmm.
They don't want to be put into a box. We have extremes on both sides. So not being tied to a political party, allows you to express your voice in the way that is most true and accurate and honest to yourself. And I don't think that's a reason for you to not be able to vote in these elections because, like I mentioned, they are important and it does affect who's going to be on the ballot for those really important elections, who ends up becoming the candidate. So,
Go ahead. No, so sorry. Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Well,
No,
I just am wondering here as you're talking about this. Um, we were talking before the Zoom recording started, and I was in a different state 20 something years ago covering a lot of this stuff. It was Connecticut. Connecticut, passed one of the largest campaign finance reforms back in the 2000s because a governor went to prison. And yet, and they were beginning to talk about looking at open primaries in 2003, 2004. My understanding 20 years on is that they still don't have it because basically what you have is you have both party members of parties, Republicans and Democrats, really pushing back on both ends. Then you have people who are maybe Democrats and Republicans who push for it. This is one of these issues where it doesn't easily align with what you think Republicans stand for or Democrats stand for. This is about power and who gets to. Is that what you're encountering up in the state house, roundhouse? You find some people who are like, "Hey, yeah, I like this." Other people are like, "No, Democrats and Republicans."
yeah, absolutely. Both that I think that's accurate.
Yeah.
One is that there will be a lot more people voting in these primary elections that aren't affiliated with our party, and we want to keep the candidate who is affiliated with our party to be deep in our party's values. So think of like a moderate, centric Republican or Democrat, winning a primary election that might have different ideals than what the party's, agenda is. The other piece about it, because you mentioned control, is also like the influence of the elections. And there's sometimes the conversation around, would opening up our primary system allow for foul play,
Mm.
where bad actors will come in and put a bunch of votes for a particular party candidate that is surefire to lose later on down the line. There isn't a lot of evidence to support it, but it is talked about a lot from
Mhm.
people of both parties.
Yes.
And it's a challenging conversation to navigate
Mhm.
because you can't really prove that that is not going to happen besides saying that it doesn't really happen. And if it did,
Uh-huh.
it would be very difficult to orchestrate.
Well, it would have to be a campaign
Uh,
probably.
Yeah, absolutely. And a very quiet
Yeah.
under wraps campaign.
Right.
But you think about controlling power, like who do you want? You know, the Democratic and Republican Party want their ideal candidate to be on the ballot in November.
As we were talking about this, I just remembered what someone who had been older than I had been covering a state house much longer than I, in one of my first sessions said, just remember that, and this is about what you're encountering up there, which is you've got Democrats and Republicans who are on both sides of this issue and other issues that we will talk about actually. But um, he said there are three parties. There are Democrats, there are Republicans, and the most powerful party of all, incumbents.
Mm,
That's
Mhm.
and
absolutely.
I think that that's where we're kind of running into this, and that I'm not saying that to be
Well, I mean,
derogatory, but it just
well, the
is.
reality is that our state house elections are not very competitive, big
Mm.
picture. I mean, there's a huge percentage of our state house or incumbents who don't get an opponent. And then another whole subset of lawmakers are actually decided in the primary. Even if they have an opponent in the general, the voter registration statistics in their districts almost assure their victory in the general. So what you end up having is actually a lot of these seats being determined in the primary
Hmm.
elections. So that, I mean, it is in a way, um, all of those people who aren't registered as either party aren't in a position to help determine who those winners are. And that's just the case. I mean, it's if you look at how things play out in the elections. Well, maybe we should move on to one of the other priorities that you guys were focusing on, Mason. I mean, I noticed the salary commission for lawmakers is a big one.
Yeah, and that goes right hand in hand with what you're talking about with incumbent power, actually. Yeah, so like I was saying, New Mexico is the only state left that doesn't pay our lawmakers a salary. This is actually a relic from when our state was founded, 1912, in the Constitution. When it was written, it prohibits legislators from receiving any forms of compensation. They receive a per diem that is set at the federal rate. It does increase a little bit. And they also receive a pension, and some folks would call it a pretty generous pension. I know it was raised in this past year, but pensions you can't claim until later on down the line when you're ready for retirement. So what we what we observed with this problem is that there are lots of folks in our communities that are interested in politics, and I think even now more than ever, especially with the things that are happening on the national stage, things that are happening in our state. Like we were talking about, what recently just happened with federal dollars and how that directly impacts New Mexicans. And so imagine you're one of those impacted people and you say, I want to make a difference in this. I want to be part of the conversation. And that's the reason why I actually ended up got involved in this work. When, COVID happened and there was kind of the rallying around the Black Lives Matter movement. For me, I said, this is a really important issue for me. So I want to make sure I'm part of the conversation beyond just, regular social advocacy. However, in our state, when you start going down this road, you realize that you will not be compensated for it. And there is a lot of honor and integrity with being a citizen legislature and having everyday New Mexicans be able to serve in office and share their experience, their expertise, and their professional background. but it is unfortunately become reserved for the people who can afford it.
Mm-hmm.
Are you financially stable?
Mm-hmm.
See people who are retired. Are you in a district where you can remain an incumbent? Will you be challenged? Um, is there competition? And without this incentive for people to run and serve in office, and not even just run and win, but to serve and lead over time, we are continually lowering the bar for who's going to fill these seats, or actually
Mm-hmm.
really main keeping it the exact same. So I think that's interesting that you bring in talk about incumbent power, because they have the financial stability. They're not worried about going back to work or maintaining their job for a 2 month period. And then when you're a legislator, the work doesn't stop when the
Right.
session ends. So
There's definitely been, I mean, I have definitely heard lawmakers speak to this who are more recent lawmakers, particularly women lawmakers,
yes,
speak about the challenge of serving based on income. Um,
yeah. And
I don't,
unfortunately, recently, we've had some really great women legislators serve in office and have had to leave for this exact reason.
Mhm.
I think most recently it came to light. This issue came to light when here in Albuquerque we had our first Asian American legislator for District 19
Right,
International
right.
District,
I remember this. Yep.
and she was only able to serve one term. She was starting a family, and
Mhm.
I have a 2-year-old, so I know how difficult those first 2 years can
You're,
be.
Mhm.
yeah.
And
I'm sorry, I'm
it's
laughing because I've been there. Yes. Yeah.
yeah, those first 2 years are tough, and balancing your responsibilities as a legislator and your family and what you want to do for your community shouldn't be something that's so difficult.
Mhm.
And we need people who come from that background, and she was extremely competent.
Mhm.
She worked in our community for a very long time. She's a scholar. I really look up to her, and losing somebody like that is a tragedy, to be honest, because there's a
Mhm.
whole community of people, especially in the international district, where some of the most vulnerable people live, and it's the most culturally diverse and dense region in our state. And those people don't have a representative that reflects that.
I,
So,
I I wonder, as you were talking, because in my mind, suddenly all these other issues come in because they're all interconnected, which is staff and all this kind of stuff. But I also am thinking in keeping on around salary. Um, being around a state house for now 20 years here, and then 3 or 4 years before, I will tell you that I'm reminded every session that I'm learning something new because these issues that state lawmakers take up are Byzantinely complex, many of them.
Oh yeah.
And you really have to spend time and you have to rely on your fellow lawmakers. Like, hey, look, you take this batch of bills and you become the expert, and I'll rely, like, if you like it, Democrat or Republican, if you say it's good, then I trust you. But these issues are so complex, many of them. And I'm not just talking about legislative salary, stuff that you guys are advocating for, but I'm talking about budget stuff. I'm talking about water stuff. I'm talking about everything out there. It really is, governing is much tougher than winning an election.
Oh yeah.
And um, that occurs to me as we are talking about the salary. I will say too, there are people up at the Roundhouse who I talk to, not just lawmakers, but maybe former staff, um, who are on the opposite side. They say we're really worried about professionalizing the legislature. Becoming a farm team for, Congress or whatever, just professionalizing that. What would be your response to that? I mean, is there a response to that Common Cause has?
Yeah. You know, the work that the legislators do during this period and during the interim is extremely complex. It's hard. And that's one of the best things about us being a citizen legislature, is because people can bring in their individual expertise. Recently we had a Republican legislator who was a surgeon, and he brought a conservative view to legislation relating to like healthcare, which is very interesting. He
Mm-hmm.
didn't seek reelection. Um,
Mm-hmm.
we recently had someone leave office as well, who um, is a rancher farmer.
Mm-hmm.
That's a voice that we need. Like, we have many voices like that, but we're a very rural state. But my point is that these experiences, can be very one note, because you usually start your career, you focus on being a healthcare professional, a farmer, an advocate. So when you have the opportunity to change legislation across all different topics, what ends up happening is that you don't have all the resources necessary to do that. So you have to do the research. You have to analyze policy, maybe in other states. You have to work with your other fellow legislators. And what tends to happen is that legislators rely on people like me and organizations like Common Cause in order to bring that research to them. And especially when we move into session, when things are moving really, really fast, and you want to have talking points, you want to be able to have rebuttals and opposition or words of support for a particular legislation that you like on the surface, but you don't know everything about. You're going to be looking to advocates, lobbyists, to help inform your decisions on that. And what I say when it comes to legislative salaries is like, put me out of the job. You can hold more power and knowledge by being able to do this full time, or even maybe not full time, but being fairly compensated so you can dedicate some of your time during the interim to do the policy research, to learn new things, and then be a champion for it later on down the line.
Mm-hmm.
And so just this conversation about legislative salaries, I think, really enables legislators to have that latitude, where right now, they're looking at their own expertise and their background in order to make these decisions. But when there's really complex things happening, like federal dollars, and that's not something in your background, you may be floating in the water a little bit.
Yeah, no, I watch the legislative session pretty closely, and then throughout the year, all the interim committees, and I often think I could not do this as a volunteer. I mean, it's clear to me that I couldn't do it as a volunteer, and it's astounding to me that so many of these folks can do it. And I mean, some of them are retirees. I think there's a significant set of people in our state house who are retirees. I mean, and they're great people, and they do amazing work. So um, just to be clear, what the bill does, it's actually a resolution. It's not a bill.
That's
I
right.
mean, in kind of wonky speak, it would put on the ballot for voters to decide if, and please tell me if I've not gotten this right, a salary commission should be created. And then the salary commission would then recommend what salaries for lawmakers would be. And every 4 years or so, they would reconvene and review that again.
That's right. Yes. So it would create an independent commission, similar to other independent commissions that we have in our state. Well, they'll be able to take a look at all of the different factors when it comes to setting lawmaker salaries. And there's been some recent studies on this actually through the legislature on how much do they work during the interim, what is the majority of that work, and how much they should be paid for it. There was a recent study from UNM Bieber, the Bureau of Economic Research, about this as well, where they pulled lawmakers and they pulled in some data on like maybe potentially how much that would be, and it did fall kind of in line with what the 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 reports that came out of LCS was. That was the legislators work about 20 hours every week on policy research and analysis. They're not being paid for.
Wait,
And
during the
so
interim? During the
during
interim?
the
Oh,
interim,
wow.
yes.
All right. All right.
And so with the independent commission, they can take all of those things into account to determine what the salary would be. But the first step is to change the Constitution, that wording that it prohibits legislators from receiving compensation, which was set back in 1912. and then the creation of the new commission.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say one thing because I think everybody who's actually watching us right now knows they know what the interim is, but for people who maybe won't, who watch this later, interim is when they're not in session. It's all those months when they're not in
And they
session.
have committee hearings during the
Yeah,
interim. They
yeah.
gather all over the state. Some of them, have to drive across the state because they're all on different committees. So
Okay.
they're working through the year. So I just want to, on that note, folks who are watching, please weigh in. We have a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen here. And we'd love to hear your comments, any questions you might have, and we'll read them out and reply and respond. Maybe we should move and talk a little bit about, in the interest of time, the Campaign Reporting Act. Um, this is another priority I noticed on your list, Mason. And I'm super interested in it too, and we'll definitely be doing some reporting on this bill. It's a bill that has come back from 2023 when it almost passed the state house. It failed at the very end on the House floor, and it's an omnibus bill of sorts that makes a lot of different reforms to the Campaign Reporting Act, which is the act that kind of regulates and governs how much money candidates can raise, when they can raise it, when, that they have to publicly disclose the money, how they spend it, from who they raise it from. So it has, it's just kind of like it's the money in politics statute, really. So I'd be interested to hear from you I mean, I imagine the whole bill is a priority for you guys, but is there a particular aspect of it that you think is particularly important, or what would be your kind of big picture on the Campaign Reporting Act bill?
Yeah. So I'll go on the big picture. So big picture is definitely the transparency of where the money comes from. Right now, when it comes to reporting, there is a threshold for how much that you need to disclose on your reporting, the timeline for that. And that is determined on like where the money comes from. Does it come from an organization like a PAC? How it's spent? Are you spending this on advertisements, text messages? I think we all are really familiar with the recent text message campaign that was run by both parties during this last election, and like having definitions around that as well. And then also individuals provide contributions as well. And so sometimes all of the workings of people receiving campaign contributions in one form or another gets kind of muddy. And the result of that is that it's not a clear picture for the public. So what the Campaign Reporting Act would do is help define some of those things. Like, are you using phone calls or text messages? Are you, are you saying if this independent expenditure comes from an individual or an organization, and is it defined as a donation or a direct amount to your campaign for campaign related activities? And one of the most interesting things about this bill, that is somewhat of a loophole that exists right now, is the ability for the campaign to loan itself money, and then receive interest on it. So if a candidate gave themselves a personal independent expenditure and as a form of a loan, which campaigns can receive and charge interest on it at whatever rate that they determine, that interest payment would essentially be going back to the individual, in some cases the candidate, as earned income.
Mhm. Mhm.
Obviously that is a huge problem because
Mhm.
campaign funds are not, for your income, it's for running your campaign. So closing that loophole is super important, as well as letting the public see this money that's coming from individuals also needs to be reported on. In this bill, I believe that it would move those types of independent expenditures to a separate bank account
Mhm.
using.
Can I can I ask a question around this loan interest stuff, which we have written about in the past? In some ways, in my mind, I'm sitting here kind of connecting it to the legislative salary issue, which is some candidates have said, well, we're not paid a salary, so this is a form of revenue. I mean, a form of income. would the legislative salary, so it wouldn't negate, but would it mitigate some of that need? I don't know. I mean,
Well,
I
there's never
just
been an instance that anyone knows about that this has happened. But I mean it so I think my understanding of this is that it was identified as a gap by the State Ethics Commission. And I guess one of the things is how would you know if it had ever happened? Because people don't have to prove that they actually loan the money to themselves. So there's two things here. One,
Yes.
candidates do not have to prove that they loan themselves the money, and then they can have their campaign funds pay the loan back. So
Hmm.
it's just this kind of dark hole. I mean, and they can also they could be charging interest on the loan. And sometimes you see these loans, if you look at the reports enough, you see these loans kind of stay on the books over the years. And so
I
the other idea is that they're charging themselves interest and maybe they're just paying back the interest with campaign funds.
Yeah.
And one of the concerns, I was reading all the different agency kind of responses to the bill, and the State Ethics Commission says it would be reasonable to conclude if lobbyists are giving them contributions that are being used to then pay these loans, that there could be some quid pro quo corruption going on. I mean, State Ethics Commission, sometimes uses strong language, but they're really just kind of using plain language around what the danger here is.
It's
So
extraordinary, exactly. It's
and so
extraordinary.
I did like a kind of a review of 2024 data. I mean, I notice these loans every year. I mean, I could go probably easily go back and this would be a lot larger, but I just real quickly looked at 2024 loans from candidates to themselves, and it's over $1 million
Yeah.
in 2020 in the 2024 election that candidates have loaned themselves.
Hey,
Um,
Marjorie, we do have one question. Do we want to handle that as we go or at the end? We've got
um,
Roy Soto. Hey, Roy. And Roy and I
Hi,
go.
Roy.
He asked the question about the recession. I think it's a simple answer, right? Because I think you started the Zoom call about the Washington Post story,
Yeah,
saying that
yeah. Yeah, yeah, Roy, we noted this. We haven't had time to read all the reporting about it. So right as we started the Zoom call is when that reporting on the that Trump rescinded. So his question for folks who are listening is Trump rescinds freeze, your thoughts. So yeah, we noted that as we started. We
I
haven't had a
noted that they've rescinded it. They
Mhm.
rescinded the memo that paused all the grants and loans. That's what the
Mhm.
Post is reporting. Okay.
Right. Okay, folks, continue weighing in and asking questions and
Hopefully that answers your question, Roy.
yeah. So the Campaign Reporting Act, Mason, is I sometimes so the other loophole that you mentioned was about the this dark money group that came out in 2019 there was, and we wrote extensively about this as it was happening. Senator Worth passed a reform bill in 2019 that really brought a lot of it brought an independent expenditure reporting into the sunshine, whereas before had been very dark. And just the very next year, one of these kind of pop-up political groups spent a lot of money and they refused to disclose their donors, even though, the thought was that the Campaign Reporting Act had been revised to force that. And they found a loophole um, that basically they were able to evade reporting hundreds of thousands of dollars in donations. And this bill would close that loophole by requiring them to um, not only get in writing from their donors that they couldn't use the donors' money for elections, but they would have to put it in a segregated account from which they didn't make independent expenditures. But as I'm reading through the bill, there's so much in it. I mean, there's so many little details in it. Do you ever get concerned that that these large kind of reform bills when they come along like this, there's so much detail to digest and to really understand that it's really hard for people to grasp what all is in the bill, and that maybe that's one reason why they don't always pass. And then we have these loopholes to just stay on the books. What are some
Yeah.
strategy kind of issues around it?
So campaign finance as a whole is a complex topic, not just for legislators themselves who always have questions about when can I start receiving contributions for my next campaign. We have staggered elections here for representatives to senators. There's a prohibition period. Does that go into effect during a special session? Does that keep other candidates that aren't currently incumbents from receiving campaign contributions and those types of things? But for the public, it's no surprise that candidates receive large amounts of monies for their campaigns. You can check the Secretary of State's website. I think Rebecca Dow had some of the most campaign contributions for her recent, I would call it a re-election, but she was out of office for one period. But we all see that. We all know that. And it's called dark money in politics because we don't know where it comes from.
Mhm.
And even more so, me as an individual, if I wanted to know where my legislator received contributions from or where my contribution is going, it's a hard thing to navigate. So, and even especially with post Citizens United, where money in politics is part of free speech, it even makes it even harder to disclose this type of money because someone is saying, well, this is I like this candidate, I like what they're talking about, it aligns with my views, I'm going to give them X amount of contributions monthly, which also has a different type of reporting. So yeah, it's a hard topic for the public to navigate. I wouldn't say this type of legislation is something that an individual would need to know the ins and outs of.
Mhm.
But when it is talked about, or maybe at a point when, and hopefully this point doesn't come, where someone acts against, the Campaign Reporting Act, and we catch a bad actor, um, the public knows about it and they know why it's bad and why that happened.
Mhm. Interesting. Okay. In the interest of time, I think we should move on. I had hoped to talk a little bit about lobbyist reform, but I think we'll do that in another session because we're real interested in that. It's a lobbyist transparency, I should say, is an issue that we've long been interested in, and there are some bills around that. It's an issue that is very difficult, I have noticed, for lawmakers to push forward in the roundhouse. But never say never. And there have been incremental improvements over the years when it comes to transparency around lobbying. So we'll track that and may come back to it in a later kind of conversation. But I wanted to actually maybe pivot a little bit because I'd love to hear also one of the other priorities of Common Cause is a topic that came up on our last week and on Wednesday by someone who attended last week. Around some of the bills related to, or, around some of the initiatives around restorative practices for incarcerated people. And I
Yes.
was hoping you could maybe just tell us a little bit about this area and what are some of the bills that we should be looking at if we're interested in it and what it's about.
Yeah. So when you're incarcerated with a felony conviction, in the past, that would remove your right to vote for in perpetuity, pretty much. You're incarcerated for whatever crime was a felony, and not, as we know, like not all violent crimes are felonies, which is what most people think of when we talk about a felony conviction. And upon release, you no longer have the right to vote. And this is actually another relic of a previous era in our country, particularly the Jim Crow era, which uh, really looked to keep people of color, African Americans, from voicing using their voice, for politics, where these really important decisions are going to be made. You want to have,
Convict lease programs. I'm sorry, I'm from the deep South. Convict lease programs, black codes, all this
yeah,
kind of stuff. Those are, sorry, the names. I grew up in the South. This is, yeah, I'm sorry.
no, you're
I
right. You're
agree.
right there.
I agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I mean, it's the 21st century, right? And so now people who were incarcerated come out, politics is changing, and it has a direct correlation on your life moving forward. And so, fortunately, here in New Mexico, we had a recent change to that where people who were formerly incarcerated or are being released from a felony conviction now have the ability to register and vote. So they have had their rights restored. This is huge for people who are coming from incarceration and returning to life as a citizen, because being active in spaces where you're involved in your community is extremely important for someone to just be in community, one, but having the ability to use your voice in this way can reduce recidivism, which is, being incarcerated once again. It gives you a sense of purpose. It allows you to say, I had this particular experience, and I know that this candidate understands that and is going to stand for my values if they're elected. But if you don't have the ability to vote, you're kind of isolated from that conversation. And so being able to restore somebody's rights as someone who's been formerly incarcerated is extremely beneficial to just their well-being as a person, and gives them, the feeling, not just the feeling, but the fact that they are an American citizen and they do have a voice in politics.
Wasn't there, I mean, right now, I believe there was a 2023 law that was passed that basically said if you are released, you can still be on parole and probation, right?
That's right.
You can vote. That was a new law, but there was some difficulty in implementation leading up to the 2024 general election, and there was a suit that forced the Secretary of State and everybody else to kind of fall in line. So this legislation would tell me how that would, right now we have that system, but what exactly would it, to tell me again, I'm sorry, I was kind of focusing on what you said, but oh, I think we just lost Mason.
Okay, well, hopefully he comes back.
Yeah,
Wanted to
we have,
make sure we had,
I think he's back.
oh,
We'll
hi,
see.
Mason. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. My computer was on low, but I was ready.
Right. All right. All right. Can you say again, like what, like this push, how that would intersect with what I was describing? Um,
So, yes, here in New Mexico, that law is already in effect, right? But across the nation, it's not. Not everywhere has
I,
the ability to
I
uh,
see.
go and vote after being incarcerated. So, like I mentioned at the beginning, we're in like 38 states. One of the states that has recently done this, and actually has gone a step beyond this to make sure that folks that are in custody but still eligible to vote have the ability to vote. And that is Illinois. So that's also something that we want to look at here in New Mexico, because folks can be in custody, they haven't received a conviction, and when the election comes about, they still retain the right to vote, but are essentially being denied because there aren't voting centers
Mm,
inside of the detention centers. So
right.
it's a complex issue that is central to, like, what are your rights as a citizen during and after the process, after the justice process, which
Uh-huh.
is you still have the right to vote if you don't have a conviction, and then after you've served your sentence, you've done your time. What are your rights after? And we believe that yes, you should have the ability to vote, because your, like I mentioned before, your experience, that experience, can really help other policymakers and lawmakers change our system for the
Hmm.
better going forward.
So, what is there a particular bill that we should be tracking on this?
So right now, there's no legislation that's been introduced in regards to changing anything with the right to restoration. Trip, you mentioned the 2023 Voting Rights Act, which changed the language for folks that have been formerly incarcerated. But what we would be looking at in the future are things like, how do we mandate for folks to have access to voting centers while they're in custody? And that's something that will have to be done at the municipal level.
Okay.
Larger picture in the future will also be things like prison gerrymandering. If you're in custody,
Mm-hmm.
um, are you determined to be a resident of the
Mm-hmm.
district in which you're in custody or your home district. You know, some
We're
people
very, yes,
your
we've talked
sentences.
about this. Yeah, yeah. It's
You know,
very,
so there's a lot of different layers to this. As of right now, there hasn't been anything introduced, but we work with folks from organizations like the Sentencing Project,
mhm.
who are looking at that and trying to figure out ways to find solutions.
I want to say that someone has, Sherry Belson has responded in our Q&A about you have to get in touch with your local county clerk. This is about, I think, restoring your rights and ask what the county rules are for reinstating voter rights for felons.
Mm-hmm.
In
Also,
McKinley County, the individual needs to walk into the office to reinstate their voter's right. McKinley County, the deputy clerk, I think the deputy clerk wants to meet individuals at the window. So, and then it's each county and state is different. So, okay, that's thank you, Sherry. Marjorie, before we exit, do we want to handle there's one question that I answered in I took typed an answer to, and it was from Bill Jepson, who asked, how can I find audio recordings? I interpreted that as maybe recordings for committee meetings. And I pointed him to the NMLegis, NMLEGIS.gov. That's the legislature's website where you can go and the tab is webcast and you can punch on the webcast tab and then it will list in the number of committee meetings that are meeting live right now. And they've also archived previous meetings that you can go look at. Hopefully, I
Mm-hmm.
answered that question correctly. And then Mary Smith is asking about an IPRA bill, which is
Um,
139 IPRA changes. I don't know anything about this bill, so
yeah, Mary, I don't think it looks to me like it's been introduced. There's not an analysis on it yet. She doesn't have any co-sponsors. So I think it's brand new. Definitely we'll be looking at that.
thank you for raising it with us.
Thanks for raising it. And we'll be interested to see what organizations like the Foundation on Open Government have to say about that bill. Because we're all very interested in IPRA. But before we leave, I just want to, Mason, on the prison gerrymandering, just to back to that for a second. Bella Davis, a reporter with New Mexico in Depth, did some reporting about prison gerrymandering a few years ago, in 2021, actually. So she wrote about prison gerrymandering. And
Wow.
in the course of that reporting, um, we wanted to look at, so the idea is that people are put into prison and they might be from, say they're from Albuquerque. And then if they get sent to a prison somewhere else,
mm,
um, and then during the redistricting process, is that county all of a sudden larger for census purposes and therefore it gets all of the more resources? Because
mm-hmm,
the census data determines so much about resources. Whereas maybe the community in Albuquerque that the person's from and their family resides and where they will return to maybe a year later is considered smaller for census purposes. And so we IPRA'd, well, Bella IPRA'd, she used IPRA to IPRA the zip codes of people entering prison, um, to find out where they were from, just to kind of get a sense, because there was no real data around this, and the corrections department basically refused to hand over that entity. So Bella basically complained to the attorney general, and the attorney general issued a letter saying that they had to turn over that data. So we did a follow-up story. And I'm just kind of looking at it now to remind myself.
Involves money and resources. That's what this is. It's like I think
Yeah.
they're
And
they're
what
located in
we
rural communities. Yeah.
so what we found in 2021 was that while nearly a third of New Mexico state prisoners who disclosed where they were living prior to incarceration gave Albuquerque addresses,
mm-hmm,
in the country's once a decade census, they're counted as living in smaller towns and rural areas. So it's no surprise because a quarter of New Mexico's population lives in Albuquerque that there would be a prevalence of residents from the largest city in the correction system. But so we basically found that kind of shift in population and really kind of just this rough analysis we did based on the towns that people came from when they entered the prison population. So
Yeah.
if anyone's interested in that reporting, you'll find it under Bella Davis's byline on our site back in 2021.
Our site is nminDepth.com. Just want
Yes.
to make sure because some people may watch it afterwards and not know what our URL is. I think we're being told that we need to wrap it up.
Okay. So, Mason, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for
Thank
having me.
you.
That's been great.
Listen.
It really has. Sometimes Sherp and I were just talking to each other, and we're like, we really ought to rely on people who spend all of their time on this particular subject. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, happy to join anytime.
okay, thank you so much. And thanks for everyone who joined us. We'll look for a recording of this session as well as the transcript on our site by the end of the week. I don't know if it'll happen tomorrow, but by Friday. So thank you so much,
Thank
and
you,
we'll
everyone.
talk soon.
Jason,
Bye.
thank you, everyone who attended.